Today is May 26, 2024. The U.S. proxy war against Russia and Ukraine continues. The cost for Ukraine continues to rise. Russia's strategy of attrition continues to grind down Ukrainian military capabilities. Ukrainian trained manpower, its equipment, its weapons, and also its ammunition. Let's look at the live map. This is liveuamap.com. It is a pro-Ukrainian live map, so keep that in mind when we look at it. And again, as you can see, there is fighting along the line of contact stretching from Zaporozhye through the Donbas region and now continuously along this front in Kharkov, just north of Kharkov city. And look at this on this map. The red rifle icons mean Russian forces are on the offensive. The blue rifle icons mean Ukrainian forces are on the offensive. Now, I have explained in depth over the last several months the price that Ukraine is paying just to hold on to territory, irrationally hold territory. They have no way of defending long-term. They're expending manpower, equipment, weapons, also ammunition, exhausting ammunition, holding this territory for political objectives. This has nothing to do with strategy or tactics. This is all about politics and public relations and the image of a strong, persevering Ukraine versus what Ukraine actually is. It is in irreversible decline. It is a fading nation state, and its military is crumbling. It is exhausting. The reason Russia opened this front in Kharkov, other than obviously push the fighting back away from the border with Russia, Belgorod, it is to further overextend Ukrainian forces. Just by reinforcing the defenses in the Kharkov region, Ukraine is overextending their forces even further than they already are. And they are already starting to crumble all along the line of contact. By going on the counteroffensive, not only are you suffering losses by defending, now you are suffering losses through offensive operations, which ordinarily suffer higher casualties than defending. So this is a strategy, as Alexander Mikuris points out often on his daily videos, this is a strategy Ukraine is adopting for political reasons, for public relations purposes, but that is strategically playing into Russia's hands. Let's take a look at how the Western media is covering this. This is from The Economist, Ukraine's desperate struggle to defend Kharkov. It is holding off Russia's attack for now. The whole point, again, is not for Russia to sweep in and take territory, to surround Kharkov city and capture it. It is to compel Ukrainian forces to redeploy whatever reserves they have left to the Kharkov region to overextend their forces further. This is what the article says. 10 days after the start on May 10th of Russia's offensive in Kharkov province, the pace of the advance has slowed. For now, Ukraine is holding the Russians roughly halfway through Volchansk, a town just 5 kilometers from the border. That is now being turned to ashes, and positions roughly 9 kilometers inside Ukraine further west near Lipsy. With an estimated 48,000 troops ready, Russia does not have the forces for a major attack on Kharkov city, Ukraine's second biggest. But local military leaders insist that the situation remains precarious and could change quickly. Russian columns were halted only after several experienced brigades were redeployed and came to the rescue, one says. Vladimir Putin will surely try his luck by opening a new attack somewhere else in the region. That is exactly the whole point of this strategy. It was not to take Kharkov city, it was to force Ukraine to redeploy its reserves, some of its best units. If they are in Kharkov, they're not in the Donbas region where Russian forces are also applying pressure. So again, this is what Russia has been doing. It applies pressure along the entire line of contact, and it has been increasing that pressure both in intensity, but also across a longer and longer line of contact, and it just continues to stretch Ukrainian forces thinner and thinner. The article claims that there were plans captured from Russian soldiers indicating that there was actually an operation meant to encircle Kharkov. And then they claim that Russian President Vladimir Putin is kind of backpedaling by saying, no, this was just to create a buffer. So this is a redux of the Kiev in 3 days narrative. They create this false Russian military objective that never existed, makes absolutely no sense at all. And then by claiming Russia has not achieved this, that even though they are making advances, they have taken territory from Ukraine. Ukraine has obviously suffered another defeat in yet another area along the line of contact. They can make it almost out as if Russia is the one that has failed. But then they talk about how poorly Ukraine's defenses in the Kharkov region, how poorly prepared they were. This is what it says. It says, on the Volchansk axis, further east, the Russian plan had been to fight to the town of Perchini. The Russians initially made quick work of this operation, sweeping through an area that should have been prepared with minefields and serious engineering fortifications, but wasn't. They were simply allowed to walk through, complains Denis Yaroslavsky, a special forces officer whose social media posts on May 12th alerted the outside world to the possibility of a wider reverse. We were watching them cut through the border fence on screens at around 11 p.m. on May 9th, and I said to my men to watch how they would blow themselves up on mines. There were no explosions. They simply carried on. So what this indicates is that Russian forces know more about Ukrainian defenses than this Ukrainian special forces officer. Then the article says many of the soldiers in Kharkov are angry that Russia was able to advance so far so quickly. Some of them criticize delays in Western aid, which they believe encouraged Russian aggression and weakened Ukrainian defenses. I'm going to get into that in a minute, and I'm sure people following my regular updates already know what I'm going to say. Others suspect that incompetence or even treachery played a more significant role. Conspiracy theories to the effect that politicians in Kiev or Washington may be selling Kharkov down the river ahead of an ugly peace deal. So these rumors are also circulating. In reality, this is the predictable outcome, the inevitable outcome of Russia's strategy of attrition. It has always been, for the past 2 years plus, to grind down Ukrainian forces. It has never been to sweep through Ukrainian lines and seize large tracts of territory. That's never been Russia's objective. You could argue in the very beginning of the special military operation, that was an attempt to shorten this conflict. It was a gamble. If it had worked, it would have saved everyone all of this death and destruction, but it did not work. So the other plan was always to wage a war of attrition. And we always hear from Western analysts and commentators, politicians, even military leaders, that Russia wanted to take Kiev in 3 days. That failed. So they didn't know what to do. So now they're just fighting on using the strategy of attrition. But a strategy of attrition requires years of preparation for it to succeed. Russia prepared years in advance for a large-scale, intense, protracted war of attrition against NATO and NATO-backed proxies. That was what they were preparing for. So plan A may have been to sweep in and cause a very quick collapse of the Ukrainian government and military, but when that didn't work, they were fully prepared for an extensive, long-term war of attrition, which is what they are doing now. And the predictable outcome is that Ukrainian military capabilities will be ground down faster than the West can build them back up. Trained manpower will be eliminated faster than it can be trained and put back on the battlefield. And what eventually happens is that Ukrainian forces are stretched thin everywhere. They're unable to fight effectively anywhere. That is what we see. There will be localized collapses. There will be larger regional collapses, and then there will be a total collapse eventually. That is where all of this is heading. Getting back to this claim that this is all owed to delays in Western aid, the U.S., the funding delay, prevented arms and ammunition from reaching Ukraine. I have been talking about this for the last 2 years, over 2 years, about how there was a process of collapse taking place already long before the delay began. There were shortages in everything: armored vehicles, trained manpower, artillery shells, artillery systems, counter battery, radar, electronic warfare systems, drones, air defenses, aircraft. There were shortages of all of this before the delay in funding started. This was already a process that was irreversible. The funding being frozen, the shipment of weapons being delayed obviously didn't help, but it's honestly not going to make any difference now that it has started again. I want to remind people of this article from September 2022. Business Insider. The U.S. has given Ukraine nearly 1 million 155mm artillery shells. Now it's looking for U.S. companies to build more of them. I made a video covering this article specifically because even then it was obvious that the United States, Europe, were not making enough artillery shells. They were nowhere close to the number of shells Russia had on hand, and that Russia was producing annually, production that has only expanded since then. This is what the article says. September 2022. The U.S. has sent 126 M777 cannons and more than 800,000 rounds of 155mm ammunition to Ukraine as of early September 2022. Now the Pentagon fears that American ammunition stocks are reaching dangerously low levels. It was obvious they were out of shells and they were not making enough. Even then, Wall Street Journal reported, citing defense officials. So if that was the case, September 2022, production has not been increased fast enough, and it will never be expanded extensively enough to match or exceed Russian shell production. The outcome was always going to be Ukraine being outgunned on the battlefield. If most casualties admittedly are owed to artillery on both sides, the side with more artillery is going to be inflicting more casualties and suffering fewer casualties of their own, which is why when you go to Media Zona, this website, this project run by U.S. government-funded Russian opposition, always hear about 400, 500,000 Russian casualties or dead Russian soldiers. We hear about this all the time, but over the 2+ years, this project has only accounted for around 54, let's just round it up to 55,000. If you come down here, they have this chart that tracks daily deaths since February 2022. And you can see that in the initial operation began, there was a spike. It kind of went down, went back up. This was Bakhmut. It went down, and then at Diivka, and as you can see, between April and May, it has gone down. It's been going back down. And as you can see, over time, Russian casualties in general are going down. They're trending downward from their highs, which was during the Bakhmut operation. That is a reality. Ukraine running out of weapons and ammunition, running out of trained manpower, that is reality. That is reality that began before the delay in Western funding, U.S. funding. Europe continued funding and arming Ukraine. I want to kind of go now to what is the main topic of this video, and that is the theory of victory. We hear this often across circles of Western analysts, commentators, military experts, so-called military experts, American and European politicians. A theory of victory. There's actually an article here in Foreign Affairs titled "A Theory of Victory for Ukraine. With the right support and approach, Kiev can still win." And the short of all of this is no, Ukraine cannot win. There is no version of this story where Ukraine wins. Who is this by? This is by Andrei Zagorodnyuk and Elliot A. Cohen. So Andrei here, he is a relatively recent former Minister of Defense of Ukraine, advisor to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Now he is a fellow at the Atlantic Council. This is a U.S. government, NATO, arms industry, oil industry funded think tank, a pro-NATO, pro-war, anti-Russian think tank. And of course, Elliot Cohen is a Bush-era State Department official who now populates various think tanks promoting U.S. wars of aggression all around the globe, including the U.S. proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. It's important to understand who these people are and how they have tied their very sense of identity to American exceptionalism, American primacy and dominance around the globe, and this deep necessity for challenging and eliminating peer and near-peer competitors like Russia and China. This is at the very root of everything they think about. This is why, as I read through this, you will see they are making this irrational argument to compel Ukraine to continue fighting on, despite the fact that they are decisively, irreversibly losing, and that as they fight on, the cost will just go up higher and higher for the Ukrainian people and their future. So this is how it begins. U.S. government decided to provide more assistance to Ukraine just in the nick of time. By the end of April, right before the aid package passed, war-torn country was emptying its last reserves of ammunition and rationing artillery shells, rounds and shells. You can tell these are people that do not understand anything about modern warfare or even military industrial capacity, as you will soon see. Ukrainian forces began to lose ground in part as a result, but we remember they lost Bakhmut, they lost Avdiivka. They were losing Avdiivka before the delay. They continued to lose Avdiivka throughout the delay, and they are still now losing territory despite the ammunition finally being sent. And they will continue to lose territory. That is all they have been doing all along. Even at the height of the 2023 Ukrainian offensive, and in its wake, Ukraine actually lost more territory to Russia than it gained. That was according to the New York Times, people might remember. The $60 billion now flowing into Ukraine will help correct these disparities, providing Kiev an opportunity to stop Russia's offensive. The aid package also serves as a massive psychological boost, giving Ukrainians newfound confidence that they will not be abandoned by their most important partner. And that is actually the main reason the aid was provided, and that articles like this are written to compel Ukrainians to fight on despite the futility of doing so. So the opening paragraphs completely detached from reality, ignoring the last 2 years of fighting. Before the delay, there was already an insufficient amount of weapons and ammunition going to Ukraine. And now that it has begun, again, Russia's advantages have only multiplied. Ukraine is still receiving insufficient amounts of arms and ammunition. So just keep all of this in mind. Reality versus the fantasy world reflected in this op-ed. But the aid package alone cannot answer the central question facing Ukraine: how to win the war. Neither can contributions from Europe and beyond, necessary as they are to keeping Kiev afloat as the conflict drags on. What Ukraine needs is not just more assistance, but also a theory of victory, something that some of its partners have studiously avoided discussing. The United States has never planned out its support for Kiev beyond a few months at a time, even as Congress mandated the provision of long-term U.S. strategy for its support of Ukraine as a part of the aid bill. It has focused on short-term maneuvers such as the much-anticipated 2023 counteroffensive rather than viable long-term strategies or aims, including a potential triumph over Russia. This is not true. The United States did have a long-term plan for Ukraine long before the special military operation began. As a matter of fact, they had a strategy that sought to deliberately provoke a Russian military intervention that they knew would completely destroy Ukraine. The objective was to use the conflict as a means to overextend Russia and possibly precipitate a Soviet Union-style collapse. And we remember that being documented in great detail in the 2019 Rand Corporation paper titled Extending Russia, Competing from Advantageous Ground. We remember that there were many chapters dealing with creating geopolitical and military dilemmas for Russia all along its periphery, including providing lethal aid to Ukraine. And I'm going to read that part to you. The United States could increase its military assistance to Ukraine. Remember, this is 2019. In terms of both quantity and quality of weapons, the United States could also become more vocal in its support for NATO membership for Ukraine. Why? Because they thought that would deter Russia, a military intervention in Ukraine, or precipitate one. Expanding U.S. assistance to Ukraine, including lethal military assistance, would likely increase the costs to Russia in both blood and treasure of holding the Donbas region. More Russian aid to the separatists and an additional Russian troop presence would likely be required, leading to larger expenditures, equipment losses, and Russian casualties. The latter could become quite controversial at home, as it did when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Two other somewhat more speculative benefits might flow from such an expanded U.S. commitment. Countries elsewhere that look to the United States for their security might be heartened. So other proxies the U.S. is using against other U.S. adversaries like China would be convinced to continue playing the role of proxy as a battering ram for the United States against America's adversaries. And of course, that was 2019. And today, listening to U.S. politicians, military leaders, commentaries, analysts, they all talk about how essential it is for the U.S. to prevail in Ukraine, because if they don't, other countries, other entities that the U.S. is using as proxies, the Philippines, for example, against China, or the Chinese island province of Taiwan that the U.S. is using against the rest of China, if they see Ukraine's absolute and utter destruction, its abandonment by the United States, they may not be so willing to follow in Ukraine's footsteps. But the point is, the plan all along was never to defeat Russia and protect and preserve Ukraine. It was always to throw Ukraine into the fire as a means of overextending and collapsing Russia. The fate of Ukraine is the least of Washington's concerns. I think that's clear to all now. Getting back to foreign affairs and its theory of victory. It says, to this point, Ukraine has been clear about its objectives. They include the liberation of all territory within its internationally recognized borders, the return of prisoners of war, deported citizens, and kidnapped children. Again, just completely contrived claims. Justice through war crimes prosecution and compensation, and the establishment of a long-term security agreement. But Kiev and its partners are not yet on the same page regarding how these might be achieved, because it cannot be achieved very clearly. And not to spoil the ending, this article, this op-ed, does not provide any means of doing this. No one, it seems, has come up with a theory of how Kiev can win, nor had the authors. By the end of this op-ed, they failed to do so as well. It's time for that to change. The West must explicitly state that its goal is a decisive Ukrainian victory and Russian defeat, and it must commit to supplying Kiev with direct military aid and to supporting the country's burgeoning defense industry, neither of which exists. There is no burgeoning defense industry in Ukraine, and the direct military aid by additional direct military aid to Ukraine from the United States, from Europe, does not exist. They are already giving absolutely everything that they have to Ukraine already. There is no more to give Ukraine. Ukrainian forces, meanwhile, must work to advance until they can expel Russian forces from all occupied territory, including Crimea. As Ukraine makes progress toward this goal, it will eventually become clear to Russian citizens that they will continue to lose not only ground in Ukraine, but also vast human and economic resources and their future prospects for prosperity and stability. At that point, Russian President Vladimir Putin's regime could come under substantial pressure from both within and without to end the war on terms favorable to Ukraine. And honestly, if reading this, you have to continuously check the top of the article to make sure that it says 2024 and not 2022. That is how out of touch with reality this op-ed actually is. It never explains how Ukrainian forces can suddenly start taking back all of this territory. As I just explained, even on the pro-Ukrainian map, they show how overextended Ukraine is and how they're losing territory all along the line of contact. So how are they going to reverse that? Especially considering the categorical failure of the 2023 Ukrainian offensive, decisively defeated by Russian forces. It continues, it says, threatening Russia's control of Crimea and inflicting grave damage on its economy and society will, of course, be difficult. Difficult is an interesting way to put it. a more accurate way to put it would be impossible. But it is a more realistic strategy than the proposed alternative, a negotiated settlement while Putin is in office. Putin has never agreed to respect Ukrainian sovereignty and never will. And of course, speaking of sovereignty, it was the United States initially overthrowing the Ukrainian government, the elected government, in 2014, that tipped this whole chain reaction off in the first place. Then the article tries, but ultimately fails to explain how this can be done. And of course, they repeat every single tired narrative that has already been floating out there. There really is nothing revolutionary here, but I think it's important to go over it anyway, because this is the current mindset of people in Washington, London, and Brussels. Moscow is no invincible juggernaut. Russia's small gains were made possible only by its overwhelming advantage in firepower, which occurred only as a result of the disruption of Western aid. And I have explained over and over again that Russia decisively outnumbered Ukraine even before the delay, according to the Western media itself. The country's artillery systems are based on old models and lack precision and long-range capabilities. Its multiple launch rocket systems, tanks, and aviation equipment are no match for Western models. Categorically untrue. Again, admitted by the Western media itself. I've gone over article after article after article, and I will do it later on. Once I wrap up with this, I will talk about other instances where Russian technology outperforms Western systems on the battlefield in Ukraine. If Ukraine can increase precision strikes by long-range artillery, it can turn the war's arithmetic against Russia and impose an unacceptable rate of attrition on Moscow. But if not enough precision-guided munitions are produced across the collective West, nowhere close to the amount produced by just Russia itself, increasing their use is impossible if they don't exist in the first place. Again, this is something completely ignored by these authors who are obviously detached from reality, not interested in reality. Eventually, Russia will be unable to replace its manpower and materiel fast enough. And what they're describing is actually Ukraine. This is what has happened to Ukraine. They're talking about winning a war of attrition against Russia, who is already clearly, admittedly outproducing the collective West. And the collective West admittedly has no plan, not now, not in 1 or 2 years' time, not even 3 to 5 years' time. They have no plan to expand production to even match where Russia is now, let alone where Russia will be in 3 to 5 years. The country's economy simply will not be able to sustain this war in the face of constant losses. If Ukraine has enough supplies, it'll be able to keep Russian artillery at bay. Enhanced air defenses, including F-16 fighter jets equipped with long-range air-to-air missiles, would reduce Russian attacks on critical infrastructure inside Ukraine, as well as on units stationed near the front. Again, a demonstration of a complete ignorance in regards to modern warfare. And I have gone over this over and over again, how long it takes to train pilots on a new airframe, the fact that it takes years to do, the fact that not enough F-16s are even going to be transferred over to Ukraine in the first place to make a difference, even if NATO pilots were flying them, the fact that these F-16s do not possess capabilities that Ukraine's original air force that has been wiped out didn't have. And so it is this wonder weapon syndrome that they're deferring to, hand-waving, to try to explain how this can all be turned around. Of course, it cannot. It hasn't been turned around. It's not going to be turned around. The F-16s are not the first wonder weapon that have been waved around. We heard this about Western artillery, the M777, for example, HIMARS, Western main battle tanks, cruise missiles, the Storm Shadow, the Scalp, on and on. With Russian forces increasingly paralyzed, Ukraine would soon be able to use its Western long-range systems, such as its Army Tactical Missile Systems, better known as ATACMS, to take down Russian command and control centers and air defense assets, which is the exact same thing they said about HIMARS. And HIMARS did manage to hit command and control centers. It did manage to take out air defense systems, Russian artillery systems. but just never on a scale large enough to make any difference. Russia by far manufactures many more of these systems than Ukraine, even with HIMARS and ATACMS, are capable of taking out. I will get into that more in just a moment, because there was a recent claim by Ukraine that they used ATACMS to take out what appears to be a battery of Russian air defense systems, maybe S-300, S-400. We cannot verify this yet. I will get into that in just a moment. And I will show you, again, just how out of touch this narrative actually is. So let's continue. The process of softening Russian positions and weakening Russian resolve will likely take about a year. Wow, that is very optimistic. Again, considering what went into the 2023 Ukrainian offensive and how catastrophically disastrous that all was. After which Ukraine should claim the initiative. Kiev should again launch limited counteroffensives, which will allow it to retake key terrain. If the previous offensives couldn't, why would these additional counteroffensives succeed, where the previous much larger offensives have failed? If this assault is successful, Putin's regime could face crisis bred of heavy losses and battlefield failures. And as Alex Christoforou of the Duran often says in his daily videos, highly recommend people check out him and Alexander Mikioris. He talks about how we've all seen this movie before. This is just a repeat of a tired and demonstrably fantastical narrative that we've already watched play out and fail. And all they're doing is reusing it again. Not because I don't honestly believe they think that it'll work this time. I think they just believe this is the best way to convince the general public to continue supporting Ukraine and to convince Ukraine to continue fighting on, despite the fact that they will most certainly lose. And not just lose the war, but lose everything else regarding their country, their future, their lives, their infrastructure, their economy, their jobs, their families, everything. Just to serve this role as a US proxy against Russia, to extend Russia. That was always the plan. It was never for Ukraine to win. It was to extend Russia at the complete expense of Ukraine. The Russian political system, after all, is already showing cracks. The mercenary leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin's failed 2023 mutiny. Okay, it was a failed mutiny, so how does that show cracks rather than resilience? The demotion or arrest of senior military officials, including General Sergei Surovikin, and the shocking success of Islamic State terrorists at striking inside Moscow in March, all reflect the regime's mounting vulnerabilities, especially this last bit about ISIS. Whenever used, and let's remember that the United States has used ISIS for years as a proxy against Syria, the US proxy war against Syria. When any crime is committed, this terrorist attack in Moscow was most certainly a crime, a heinous crime. We have to ask ourselves, who benefits? And the authors of this op-ed are admitting that US foreign policy, Ukraine as well, they are the chief beneficiaries of this terrorist attack. Let us continue. Ukraine's success on land, air, and sea must be coupled with extensive pressure on the economic and information fronts. The United States and Europe should introduce a much more aggressive sanctions campaign that includes secondary sanctions on any company operating in Russia. Russians must see their national wealth dissipating and their economy headed for permanent stunting for the consequences of Putin's invasion to hit home. Well, they've already tried that, and it has already failed, categorically failed. Not only has the Russian economy survived extreme Western sanctions, but it has built itself back up in a much more resilient way. And because of this extreme campaign of sanctions that the West is now preparing to use against China, the rest of the world is starting to catch on to what's going on here, and they're starting to proof their economy, their cooperation with countries like Russia and China against Western sanctions, making the sanctions less and less effective. So more sanctions, and again, almost as if this was written in 2022. Maybe they wrote it in 2022 Foreign Affairs asked them to write something. They weren't feeling well that day, so they just resent them something they had laying around from 2 years ago. Maybe that's what happened. Ukraine is already stepping up to meet the challenge. Kiev is increasing its ability to tap into manpower reserves by lowering the conscription age and rolling back exemptions from military service. So this is an oblique admission by the authors that Ukraine is suffering catastrophic losses. You don't change the age of conscription and make exemptions for people otherwise unfit for military service unless you are absolutely desperate for additional manpower. And you're only desperate for additional manpower because you're suffering huge, crushing losses. And bringing people into the military who would otherwise be exempt from service is desperation. The reason why you have exemptions is because you don't want people who are not fit for military service in the military. It compromises performance and effectiveness on the battlefield. You would only be willing to reverse that and compromise effectiveness if you were absolutely, utterly desperate. This is what they're admitting. The West should continue to deliver large quantities of materiel, particularly having seen how delays in aid can give Russia the upper hand on the battlefield. Again, Russia has always had the upper hand on the battlefield. Such assistance is essential to Kiev's success, but there's another major contribution the West can make. Direct collaboration with Ukraine's defense industry is already happening and already not making a difference. The sector has grown exponentially over the last 2 years. The drone industry, for instance, went from producing a handful of drones in 2022 to manufacturing tens of thousands of them today. Ukrainian-made systems have also grown more sophisticated, managing to strike targets deep in Russia in ways that would have been unthinkable in 2022. The article is ignoring that Russia makes many times more drones of all kinds and that their drones are also capable of striking targets anywhere inside Ukraine. Not only anywhere inside Ukraine, but more effectively and more frequently than Ukrainian drones are able to strike any particular target in Russia. Ukraine needs Western technologies, components, and production equipment, vendor financing, and partnerships to reach its full potential. Again, this has already been going on the entire time. If the West can deliver these resources, it cannot, so why even bother contemplating it? Ukraine's manufacturing capacity will skyrocket, bolstering the country's battlefield success. So again, let's look into the blind spots of these authors who apparently they don't know or they don't care, or they don't think you know or care about how implausible all of this is. Yes, Ukraine is making many, many times more drones than they were at the very beginning of the conflict. And they're doing it in a distributed manner. These are relatively simple things to put together. Anyone with a passing interest in electronics and local fabrication skills, 3D printing can do this. And so that is why they're able to do this. The reason Russia is making many times more drones is because not only do they have distributed networks like in Ukraine, but they also have full-fledged factories churning out thousands upon thousands of drones of all kinds. The problem for Ukraine is that if they build a factory to try to do likewise, Russia is simply just going to shoot a missile at it, destroy it, and they will be right back to where they started. And we remember very early on in the conflict, it was admitted by senior Ukrainian officials that their entire military-industrial complex, that the large factories and facilities were all targeted and destroyed. That was the first year of the conflict. If the West can help Ukraine's defense industry get fully up to speed, Russia's positions will grow untenable. The country's strategy depends on mass, its ability to allocate and concentrate forces, and some elements of technical sophistication, such as electronic warfare. But Russia is tactically poor, which makes it vulnerable to a sustained and large-scale drone-based campaign. So the new wonder weapon is drones. These drones will change everything in Ukraine's favor. Again, ignoring the fact that Russia has many more drones and more capable drones. A Ukrainian air offensive that dismantles Russian logistics, puts increasing pressure on Russia's economy and military infrastructure, and destroys rather than neutralizes the country's Black Sea fleet, would produce shocks at home that would likely endanger Putin's regime. So again, it's not even about actually winning the conflict. It's about trying to create conditions these people imagine could contribute to regime change in Moscow. And again, Alex Christofor and Alexander Mercouris have themselves been talking about this for years. This has been the obsession. I think Washington, London, Brussels, they understand they cannot win this militarily. They're hoping somehow they can create the conditions on the ground in Russia for regime change. In this war, resources, funds, and technology all overwhelmingly favor the West, and they never explain in the op-ed how that actually is. And if they tried, they would fail because it is demonstrably untrue. If they are channeled to Ukraine in sufficient amounts, including to the country's defense industry, Kiev can win. Russia simply lacks the military power to defeat a Western-backed Ukraine, and so its only hope lies in manipulating Western concerns, except Ukraine is Western-backed, has been since 2014, and Russia is decisively defeating Ukraine right now. This is why they're writing this article in the first place. It is therefore well past time for NATO governments to stop falling into Putin's trap. For the West to achieve a victory, it must stop fearing it. In doing so, it can attain security for itself and Ukraine, which has sacrificed so much, both for its own cause and for the larger cause of freedom. Again, the US violently overthrew the elected government of Ukraine in 2014, admittedly, again, coming back to here, to transform Ukraine into a NATO militarized battering ram used against Russia to overextend and collapse Russia at the cost of Ukraine itself. That was always the plan. The plan was never to save or defend or protect or build up Ukraine. It was to use it as a battering ram and then throw it away when they were done. Let's look at this this statement. In this war, resources, funds, and technology all overwhelmingly favor the West. Yes, you can look at the West's collective GDP and their military budgets. They are vastly larger than Russia's. But the problem is that is the wrong metric to look at when comparing military spending. It doesn't matter how much you're spending on military weapons, ammunition, production, development programs. What matters is what is actually being produced by this spending. If the West spends 10 times more than Russia, but virtually all of that money is being misappropriated, and what you're getting out of it is a fraction of the capabilities, a fraction of the money put in, and Russia is putting all of its money into less money, but all of that money is going to produce viable, effective capabilities, then Russia is going to come out on top, which is why Russia is coming out on top in this conflict. That is precisely the reason why. I did a whole video on the US National Defense Industrial Strategy. This was a report put out by the US government looking at the military industrial base of the United States to figure out why they cannot produce more weapons and ammunition than just Russia alone. And it came down to private enterprise and the fact that they are motivated by profit first and foremost. They have no interest in making cheaper, more numerous weapon systems because it's not profitable. And in order to actually change this, fix this problem, the United States would have to nationalize its military industrial base, which they will never do. So instead, what they try to do is create financial incentives for these companies. But again, they're handing you money. Your preference is to save as much of that money as possible as profits. It doesn't matter. The more the government hands these corporations, the more they're going to keep for themselves. It's a self-defeating process, which is why in Russia and China, the military industrial base is comprised of state-owned enterprises, and which is why it works and is much more effective than the United States and Europe, despite spending a fraction of the money on it. If the US and European military industrial base are so hopelessly corrupt and would require nationalization, which will never happen, then this theory of victory laid out in this foreign affairs op-ed is completely unrealistic. It will never happen. You cannot produce more ammunition, more weapons. You cannot expand production if your problem is systemic and you're not willing to change and reorganize the system itself. So again, just hand waving to convince Ukrainians that something is being done, to convince them to fight on, when actually nothing of any substance is being done. And the intention from the very beginning was always to use Ukraine as a disposable proxy. Because this op-ed talked about sending weapons and equipment, let's just look at the next weapons package the United States is putting together. So this is from Reuters, May 24th, 2024. U.S. preparing $275 million weapons package for Ukraine, officials say. The United States is preparing a $275 million military aid package for Ukraine, which will include 155mm artillery shells, precision aerial munitions, and ground vehicles, 3 U.S. officials told Reuters. While the package mainly includes munitions, it also includes vehicles that are designed to recover disabled tanks and other heavy equipment from the battlefield, a sign that the U.S. expects attacks and equipment losses to continue. And this is what I've been pointing out for the last 2 years plus. The U.S. is not even covering Ukraine's losses with these weapon packages. And of course, they talk about 155mm artillery shells. Production is being expanded, but nowhere near what Ukraine requires. Even by 2025 to 2027, it still will not be anywhere near what Ukraine requires. So yes, they're receiving artillery shells, but as has been the problem all along, not enough. If this is the case, Reuters, citing U.S. officials, admit that there is huge losses taking place. They are struggling with these weapon packages just to replace Ukrainian losses. How is the U.S. and its allies going to build a military critical mass on the Ukrainian side to facilitate this theory of victory mentioned by Foreign Affairs? Here is another article, CNN, the West is tapping Russian money to arm Ukraine. Much more could follow. Again, May 24th, 2024. Another complete misconception that this is a matter of money, and if you spend more money, you can send more weapons to Ukraine. It does not work that way. Money generated by Russian financial assets frozen in Europe will soon start flowing to Ukraine, giving Kiev a boost as it struggles to counter an advance by Moscow's troops. Now the West is trying to turn that trickle of cash into a flood again. You're just making more money available, more money will be taken. Production itself is not going to expand any faster than it already is. Throwing more money at it isn't going to fix that. There isn't even a discussion of how to use this money to expand production any quicker than it already is. Under the EU agreement, between 2.5 and 3 billion euros of these profits will be sent annually to Kiev. First payment will be made in July, with 90% earmarked for arms and military equipment. The split of funds will be reviewed each year starting in January 2025, with the option of shifting spending toward rebuilding Ukraine's war-torn economy as its needs change. What arms and military equipment are they talking about? Is this monthly production that can be bought and sent to Ukraine, or are they talking about contracts for weapon systems that already have backlogs of 2-3 years or more already? And just to give you an example, one of the key essential weapon systems that Ukraine requires are air defenses. Let's look at this Politico article. Germany's Ukraine Air Defense Initiative falls flat. Berlin promised to help Ukraine source crucial air defenses, but the reality has been disappointing. Very predictable. This was May 22nd, 2024. Germany responded to Ukraine's call for more air defenses by promising to send some of its own systems and marshaling others from other allies, but almost no one else is following Berlin's lead. Berlin has so far pledged 3 of its 11 US-made Patriot batteries, along with over 50 Gepard shorter-range air defense systems and air-to-air missiles. The Gepard's basically a very large gun that is used to shoot down drones. That's basically what that's used for. That is not going to do much against cruise missiles or ballistic missiles. For weeks, senior German politicians, principally Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock and Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, have been leaning on allies to follow through on their commitments to gift Patriot air and missile defense batteries to Ukraine. So what is the problem? Why is everyone so hesitant to send their Patriot missile systems and their missiles, the missiles themselves? What is the problem? And I've talked about this extensively, all since the very first mention of sending Patriots to Ukraine was made. There's simply not enough of them. And the article even eventually admits that. Germany has spent the past month talking up its immediate action on air defense initiative, as first reported by Politico, but partner nations are unwilling to send the desperately needed batteries to Ukraine. Two people familiar with the talk said. Well, the German initiative also covers alternatives such as the SAMP-T, NASAMS, Hawk. Hawk is extremely antiquated, decades old. Almost no one uses them anymore. The US stopped using them 20, 30 years ago. IRIS-T or S-300 air defense systems. It's the Raytheon-developed Patriots that are most effective against attacks. According to who? The benefits of Patriots are clear, with Ukrainian troops already trained to use the truck-mounted launcher system alongside radars and interceptors. Ukraine's original S-300 systems and the associated networked air defense systems that work together with it were by far more effective and easier for Ukraine to use. The Patriot system is hardly ideal. One of the reasons for the reluctance to send Patriots is that they are expensive, around $1 billion per unit. And each interceptor missile it fires costs millions. What's more, countries aren't willing to accept the blow to their own defense necessary to make good on deliveries to Ukraine. So the article talks about transferring these expensive systems to Ukraine would leave these countries defenseless. They could order additional systems from the United States, but there's, according to the article, a backlog of over 2 years. There's a backlog. So if you order a Patriot missile system now, you don't even think about getting it until years into the future. As I've pointed out many, many times before regarding the Patriot air defense and missile defense system, its effectiveness was in question. It was being used heavily by Saudi Arabia in its war with Yemen. Its effectiveness against cruise missiles and drones was questionable. And eventually Saudi Arabia began running out of interceptors. The United States simply doesn't make enough of them. And Saudi Arabia had to borrow missiles from neighboring countries' stockpiles. That's how bad it was. And that was right before Russia initiated the special military operation in February 2022. Now you're sending these systems to Ukraine. They're being used on a scale that they have never been used before. And obviously the interceptors have been used up. There's no way for the United States to expand production to come anywhere close to meeting Ukraine's requirements, and borrowing them from everyone around the globe is only going to work for so long. And as you can see, there's now resistance to sending additional systems. So here's another example of this theory of victory laid out by that Foreign Affairs op-ed. Here's an example of this supposed technological, military, financial advantage that the West has over Russia. This is an example of reality challenging that myth in this fantasy world that those two authors apparently exist in. Here is another article about the limits of Western technology versus Russian military technology capabilities. New York Times: Russia, in new push, increasingly disrupts Ukraine's Starlink service. Russia has deployed advanced tech to interfere with Elon Musk's satellite internet service, Ukrainian officials said, leading to more outages on the Northern Front battle line. Again, this is May 24th, 2024. Starlink has been critical to the Ukrainian military since the earliest days of the war with Russia. Without the full service, Ukrainian soldiers said they couldn't quickly communicate and share information about the surprise onslaught and resorted to sending text messages. Their experiences were repeated across the new Northern Front line, according to Ukrainian soldiers, officials, and electronic warfare experts. At the heart of the outages, increased interference from Russia. As Russian troops made gains this month near Kharkov, Ukraine's second largest city, they deployed stronger electronic weapons and more sophisticated tools to degrade Starlink service. Ukrainian officials said the advances pose a major threat to Ukraine, which has often managed to outmaneuver the Russian military with the help of frontline connectivity and other technology, but has been on the defensive against the renewed Russian advance. When has Ukraine outmaneuvered Russia? When has this happened? Did this happen during the 2023 Ukrainian offensive? Has it happened since? I'm not aware of any instance of Ukraine significantly outmaneuvering Russia. This is another one of the myths that we've always been told about Ukrainian military capabilities, that now, as things visibly start to fall apart, these myths are now faced with reality. They're dissipating, they're evaporating. It's another excuse for the deteriorating situation in Ukraine. Again, this is a war of attrition. Russia is increasing pressure on a degraded, constantly degrading Ukrainian military. It will get worse and worse, and not just in a straight line, but in a more exponential way. As this continues, as Russia improves and expands its capabilities, as it degrades Ukraine's capabilities, this will happen faster and faster. And you can make all the excuses in the world that you want. This is nothing new. And I've talked about this before. Entire videos about Russia jamming HIMARS guided rockets. This is from CNN. Russia's jamming of US provided rocket system complicates Ukraine's war front. This was last year. We have this one from Reuters. Ukraine's long-range glide bomb blunted by Russian jamming. So it is a reoccurring theme. This more recent Reuters article says Russian jamming has kept many of Ukraine's relatively new long-range GLSDB bombs from hitting their intended targets. 3 people familiar with the challenges told Reuters Ukraine over the last year sought weapons with longer ranges than the 69-kilometer guided rockets, HIMARS guided rockets, so Kiev could attack and disrupt Russian supply lines and muster points, which was what the whole theory of victory is built around, the ability to do that with these Western super weapons. But as you can see, HIMARS and now the ground-launched small diameter bombs all jammed, and it's just a matter of time before ATACMS is rendered neutral, or they just simply run out of ATACMS missiles. To answer that call, Boeing offered a new weapon to the Pentagon with a 161-kilometer range, the ground-launched small-diameter bomb. The glide bomb has small wings that extend its reach and is comprised of a GBU-39 small-diameter bomb and the M26 rocket motor, both of which are common in U.S. inventories and relatively inexpensive. But the GLSDB's navigation system, which enables it to steer around obstacles like mountains and known anti-air defenses, has been targeted by Russian jamming. 3 people briefed on the matter said. While Boeing has said the weapon can defeat some jamming, one of the sources said it would take Boeing months to fix. And by the way, by the time they fix it, Russia will just simply find another way to jam it, and they will be right back to square one, which is exactly what is going on with HIMARS and those guided rockets. So here's another example of this myth of Western military technological superiority evaporating in the face of facts on the ground, on the battlefield. Now, finally, I want to talk about ATACMS, these longer range, 300-kilometer range ballistic missiles the U.S. has sent Ukraine. They've been carrying out attacks with ATACMS. Ukraine claims that they're operating this solely by themselves, but the New York Times, other publications have admitted that NATO is basically organizing these attacks. They're using Western intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets to find targets, to provide targeting information, and Ukraine is, if even, just pushing the button. That's basically how these attacks take place. There was footage of an ATACMS with a cluster warhead targeting what looked like a battery of either S-300 or S-400 Russian air defense systems. So a number of launchers, radar, command center. And you could clearly see that at least one of these missiles got through. And the battery was launching multiple missiles at the time. All it takes is one missile to get through. And it happens. It doesn't matter how effective your air defense system. You can saturate air defenses, and you can get a missile through every once in a while, no matter how great your air defenses are. This is always a possibility. We don't have enough information about this video, the circumstances surrounding it, but we do have this article from Newsweek kind of in response to this. Not many details about this story are mentioned. How many S-400 missile systems does Russia have? May 24, 2024. So look, an ATACMS missile with a cluster warhead obviously took out some sort of high-value Russian air defense system. And you could see how elated pro-Ukrainian commentators and analysts were when they saw this video, and they were talking about the triumph of ATACMS over the best air defense systems Russia has. But again, both sides have been losing air defense systems all along. This is what would happen in any conflict where you have relatively equal capabilities on both sides. This is what the pro-Ukrainian side has been doing all along. They take these individual incidents and they extrapolate victory somehow over Russia from these single events that, when put in proper context, actually demonstrate the exact opposite, the futility of Ukraine's situation. So this Newsweek article, how many S-400 missile systems does Russia have? This is very important to understand. If you're looking at a war of attrition, you just watched Ukraine take out a battery of Russian air defense systems. It's important to know how many of these systems they still have, how many they make every single year, and what your rate of success are in destroying these systems. That's going to tell you whether you're making progress or not, especially considering all of your air defense systems are being destroyed and your allies are unable to send you additional ones, as we just talked about. Newsweek says Russia has invested heavily in the S-400 Triumph surface-to-air missile system to bolster its integrated air defense capabilities. While the exact current number is not definitively stated by the Kremlin, the available information suggests Russia likely had around 16 to 18 battalions or 56 full S-400 systems deployed by early 2020. However, Russia has suffered notable losses of these prized systems in the ongoing conflict with Ukraine. This makes it difficult to establish how many are currently operational. The Pravda state newspaper, and when you follow the links, it's actually Ukraine's Pravda, it's not Russian media, says the regular S-400 battalion consists of 8 launchers with 32 missiles and costs around $200 million. So a battalion has 8 launchers. If Newsweek is saying Russia has between 16 to 18 battalions, that means they have between 128 and 144 launchers. So let's assume that that number is correct and it's not higher, although it probably is higher. But let's just say that is what Newsweek is admitting, a pro-Western, pro-Ukrainian source. That is what they're admitting. Let's go with that number. Then on this article, Newsweek posts a list of alleged Ukrainian strikes on Russian S-400 missile systems. And down here it said that this list, known or claimed losses so far, this would suggest at least a dozen have been lost in the conflict, according to Ukraine's claims, but the numbers cannot be independently verified. So a dozen different components of the S-400 system. 12 launchers or 12 different components of the S-400 system have been damaged or destroyed. Let's just assume totally destroyed, unrecoverable, unrepairable. How many systems does Russia produce per year? So this is another number that we actually don't readily have available. What we do know is that China signed a contract with Russia in 2014 for 2 regiments of S-400 air defense systems. The first regiment was delivered in 2018, the second in 2020. So it took 4 years to send 1 regiment, 2 years to send the second regiment. A single regiment would have 16 launchers. So in the course of 4 years, Russia produced at least 16 launchers and associated equipment, the command center, radar, and everything else. But 2 years later, another 16 launchers and associated equipment were produced. So between 4 to 8 launchers and associated equipment can be produced each year. And that is the low end number, because that was between 2014 and 2020. Production numbers have almost certainly expanded, and that was just the production of systems to be exported. That was not the total production of Russian S-400 systems. Almost certainly more were being made during that period of time, but we're using the lowest end number that we can be sure of. 4 to 8 a year. Ukraine has destroyed 12 over the course of 2+ years, which is 8 to 16 over the same period of time. Russia, citing these lowest end production numbers, would be producing between 8 to 16 launchers and associated equipment. So you can see what Ukraine's problem is here. Russia is almost certainly producing many times more S-400 launchers and associated equipment than that. But even if they were only producing that, it would be enough to cover their losses following Ukrainian strikes on S-400 systems. And don't forget that Russia also has huge numbers of S-300 air defense systems, Buk, Asa, Tor, Strela, Pantsir. They have a lot of air defense systems. They all work together in network. They're producing all of these every single year. They're almost certainly outproducing what Ukraine is able to destroy any given year, which means year to year, despite these headline-grabbing successes that Ukraine has, at the end of each year, Russia actually has more air defense on the battlefield than it did the year before. And if you're fighting a war of attrition and you lost all of your air defense, and your opponent is increasing the amount of air defense it has on the battlefield, that means you're decisively losing this war of attrition, at least in terms of air defense. But as we know, in every other regard, Ukraine is losing as well. This is the reality on the ground in Ukraine versus the fantasy world that those 2 authors and many others in Washington, London, and Brussels live in, writing about a theory of victory. You can see how absolutely everything that they talked about in that op-ed is contradicted by facts on the ground, even according to the rest of the Western media. They admit that the collective West is out of air defense systems, and they have no plan on creating additional air defense systems, certainly not enough for Ukraine's requirements. And we can see that even Ukraine's greatest successes on the battlefield are ultimately futile, because Russia does have a massive military industrial base capable of not just replacing its losses, but ensuring year to year it has more assets on the ground, on the battlefield, as it continues to grind down Ukrainian military capabilities. That is the reality versus the fantasy world of any sort of theory of victory for Ukraine. But I strongly suspect that these 2 individuals and many others like them really never thought Ukraine would win. This is all about how to convince Ukraine to go willingly, feet first, into the wood chipper, a proxy war against Russia. Again, the end goal was always extending Russia, competing from an advantageous ground, and getting others to pay the cost of all of this for the United States, which means Ukraine, so that the US doesn't have to pay that price. Suffer that cost themselves. And so that is what is happening. It's important to wake people up to that reality, especially people who are still cheering on Ukraine. What you are doing is ensuring the complete, thorough destruction of that country in a war they absolutely cannot win. They cannot win, and the longer it goes on, the more people senselessly die. That is just the fact. And Russia has no reason to stop. NATO has made it abundantly clear that their goal is to encircle, contain, and eventually destabilize and overthrow the Russian political order, not just the current government, but the entirety of what Russia is as a nation state. That is their goal, to rewire it from the inside out, like they have done to so many other countries they've politically captured. Russia has the right to defend themselves. They are defending themselves. And if people actually truly care about Ukraine, they would demand that this proxy war, predicated on an unjust, expansionist agenda of the United States, of NATO, they would demand that it is brought to an end, that a peace deal be made with Russia, respecting Russia's legitimate national security concerns, and preserve what is left of Ukraine. But I don't think that that is going to happen. But people need to understand that that is the reality of all of this. I will continue tracking this conflict and all the other conflicts and interference and interventions around the globe that the US and its allies are involved in. This is all part of a global process of maintaining Western hegemony all around the globe, refusing to accommodate and coexist with a multipolar world. The multipolar world is clearly on the rise, and the West is clearly in irreversible decline, but they will never accept that, and they will continue, and it's up to the rest of the world, the multipolar world, to mitigate all the death, destruction, and instability wrought by this stubbornness. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description for other places you can find and follow my work. I highly suggest you follow my work on Telegram. Absolutely everything goes there, including full videos. In case I ever am unable to post on YouTube, and because I have problems posting on Rumble and Odyssey, all of my videos do go up on Telegram. So do links to all of my articles, including articles I'm not, for some reason, allowed to publish on X, formerly Twitter. So get on Telegram. There are so many other great resources on Telegram for you to follow, including the Duran, Scott of Calibrated, Mark Sloboda. There are a lot of sources that I follow who in turn follow and aggregate huge amounts of information from across Telegram and elsewhere. So all of those links will be in the video description below, as will all the links I referenced in this video, alongside ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel or any of my other social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or even if you have no extra resources and just helping share my work with others, getting the word out there, all of that is greatly appreciated. All of that is what makes this work possible and effective. So thank you so much for that. And as always, thank you for watching.